Pennsylvania, the birthplace of a nation, rolling farmland, steel towns, and tight-knit communities, the kind of place where the worst things simply aren't supposed to happen. But the women in this documentary shattered that sense of safety again and again, across more than a century of the state's history. They were nurses and teachers, wives and daughters, the people you'd never look at twice. And when the truth about them finally came to light, it didn't just make headlines. It left entire towns stunned, asking the same disbelieving question. How could someone like that have done something like this? That question is the thread that runs through every case you're about to see. Because the most chilling crimes aren't always the ones committed by strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come from the person sitting across the dinner table, the one holding your hand at the hospital bedside, the one you trusted most. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We've got a community all over the globe, and we love seeing where everyone tunes in. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we release a brand new true crime documentary every week. So stay with us, because in Pennsylvania, some of the deadliest people didn't lurk in the shadows. They lived right next door. Heather Presti, 2020 to 2023. On May 2nd, 2024, in a packed courtroom in Butler County, Pennsylvania, a former nurse named Heather Presti stood before a judge and did something that stunned even the people who thought they knew the full horror of her case. When one of her own attorneys asked her why she was pleading guilty, Presti answered plainly in 3 words, "Because I am guilty." With that, the woman the press had come to call the killer nurse admitted what investigators had spent more than a year uncovering, that she had used her position of trust and a common drug found in nearly every care facility in the country to quietly end the lives of the very patients she was supposed to protect. By the time it was over, she would be linked to the deaths of 17 people. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what made Heather Presti so difficult to catch. She was a registered nurse, licensed in Pennsylvania in 2018, and she worked the overnight shifts at nursing homes and skilled care facilities across the western part of the state. Nights were when staffing was thinnest, supervision was lightest, and a sudden medical emergency was least likely to draw immediate scrutiny. And her weapon of choice was insulin, a medication so ordinary in these settings that its presence would never raise an eyebrow. In the right dose, insulin saves the lives of diabetic patients every single day. In excessive amounts, it can send a person into a fatal spiral of low blood sugar, and in an elderly or already ill patient, that kind of death can easily look natural. It was, in a sense, a nearly perfect method, hidden in plain sight, inside the ordinary rhythms of a nursing home at night. Between 2020 and 2023, Presti moved through a series of facilities, and a trail of deaths followed her. She administered excessive doses of insulin to patients across 5 different care homes in Allegheny, Armstrong, Butler, and Westmoreland counties. Some of her victims were diabetic. Others weren't diabetic at all, meaning they had no medical reason to be receiving insulin in the first place, and the drug in their systems could only have come from someone deliberately putting it there. In total, 22 patients were mistreated in this way, ranging in age from 43 to 104 years old. 17 of them died. What makes the case even more chilling is that Presti's conduct was not entirely hidden from the people around her. Co-workers noticed things. She was known to speak about her patients with open contempt, making derogatory comments about them. And at times, she reportedly suggested that certain patients would be better off dead. Over the course of her career, she had been disciplined or dismissed from a striking number of workplaces, by some accounts more than a dozen, for abusive behavior toward patients or staff. And yet she kept finding new nursing jobs, moving from one facility to the next, always with access to the same vulnerable people and the same deadly tool. The warning signs were there. They simply weren't connected in time to stop her. The case that finally brought her down began at Quality Life Services, a skilled nursing facility in Chicora, Butler County, where Presti worked in 2022. There, 2 patients died within weeks of one another in December of that year, and a third was hospitalized after receiving a dangerous dose of insulin. A relative of one of the victims grew suspicious and brought their concerns to the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General, and that complaint set off an investigation that would ultimately unravel everything. In May of 2023, Heather Presti was arrested and initially charged with killing 2 patients and injuring a third. But as investigators dug deeper, and as more and more families came forward with their own suspicions about loved ones who had died under Presti's care, the scope of the case exploded. Months after her arrest, prosecutors filed dozens of additional charges, connecting her to 19 more patients across the other facilities where she had worked. The Attorney General's office laid out a portrait of a caregiver who had systematically and deliberately harmed the people entrusted to her, patients who, in the words of their own families, had depended on her completely and been betrayed in the most fundamental way. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a death sentence, Heather Presti chose to plead guilty. On that day in May of 2024, she formally admitted to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. The 3 killings she pleaded guilty to were those of James Bartow, who was 55, Gerald Schrum, who was 90 and a military veteran, and Nicholas Simbel, who was 43. Investigators had by then linked her to a total of 17 deaths, but these 3 were the cases where the physical evidence was strongest, where the proof of what she had done was undeniable. The sentencing that followed was among the most severe a Pennsylvania court can hand down. Presti received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, and then, stacked on top of that, an additional term of 380 to 760 years for the attempted murders. It was a sentence designed to send a single, unmistakable message that she would never, under any circumstances, walk free again. She was sent to the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, Pennsylvania's prison for women. The plea hearing itself was heavy with grief and fury. Nearly 40 family members of Presti's victims came to court to speak, and one after another they described the people they had lost, not as case numbers, but as human beings. Nicholas Simbel was remembered as a social, warm-hearted man who loved his sports teams. Gerald Schrum was honored as a lifelong patriot whose daughter said she was haunted by imagining his final moments. Again and again, the families made the same point, that although some of their loved ones were elderly and some were seriously ill, not one of them had been ready to die, and none of them had asked Presti to make that choice for them. One speaker told the court, in words that captured the room, that Presti had wrongly tried to play God. Another said she was not sick or insane, but simply evil. Throughout it all, Presti showed little visible reaction. There is one detail that lingers over this case, a question that has never been fully answered. Presti reportedly told her own attorney that she believed she was ending her patient's suffering, a claim of misguided mercy. But that explanation collided directly with the evidence. With the patients who weren't dying, the ones who weren't even diabetic, and above all with her own documented cruelty toward the people in her care. The prosecutors and the families rejected the idea of mercy entirely. To them, this was not compassion gone wrong. It was a predator who had found the ideal hiding place, a profession built on trust, filled with vulnerable people, where death was expected and rarely questioned. The Presti case has since become a national cautionary tale, prompting hard questions about how a nurse fired from so many jobs could keep working with the most defenseless patients imaginable, and about how many of her victims might have been saved if the warning signs had been heeded sooner. 17 families were left to grapple with the possibility that a loved one's death, long accepted as natural, had been anything but. And at the center of it stands Heather Presti's own 3-word admission, a rare moment of blunt honesty from a woman who spent years hiding her crimes in the quiet hours of the night. Because I am guilty. Irene Schroeder, 1929 to 1931. On the morning of December 27, 1929, on a stretch of highway between Butler and Newcastle, Pennsylvania, 2 state highway patrolmen flagged down a passing Chevrolet. Inside were 2 men, a young woman, and a 4-year-old boy. A group that looked, at a glance, like an ordinary family out for a drive. It was anything but. Just a short time earlier, the adults in that car had robbed a grocery store in Butler at gunpoint. When the officers approached, a gun battle erupted on the roadside. Corporal Brady Paul, a 29-year-old patrolman, was shot and mortally wounded. And according to eyewitnesses who watched from a nearby house, the person who fired on him was not either of the men. It was the young woman, a 20-year-old former waitress named Irene Schroeder. Within 2 years, she would make history in the worst possible way, becoming the first woman ever put to death in Pennsylvania's electric chair. Irene Schroeder was born Irene Crawford in 1909 into a poor family in the Ohio River Valley near Wheeling, West Virginia. Life offered her little. She married young, at just 15, to a man named Homer Schrader and had a son, Donnie, about a year later. But domestic life didn't hold her, and before long she left her husband and took work as a waitress in Wheeling. It was there that she met a man who would change the course of her life and end it. Walter Glenn Daig. Daig was, on paper, a respectable figure, a World War I veteran, a former Sunday school teacher and Boy Scout leader, a married father of 2, and more than a decade older than Irene. But when he met her, he abandoned everything. In the spring of 1929, Daig walked out on his wife and children to be with her, and soon after, he lost his job. Unemployed and restless in the first hard months of the Great Depression, the couple made a fateful choice. Rather than look for honest work, they decided to take what they wanted at gunpoint. Around the late summer of 1929, they bought several revolvers from pawn shops in Pittsburgh, and together with Irene's older brother Tom Crawford, they began a string of armed robberies, hitting gas stations and stores across a wide circuit stretching from Ohio into Pennsylvania and beyond. Their crimes were planned and carried out with a boldness that impressed even the investigators who later studied them. And disturbingly, Irene often brought her little boy, Donnie, along. Some believed it was simply reckless parenting. Others suspected it was deliberate, that a car carrying a woman and a small child drew far less suspicion than 2 armed men, making the child a kind of human camouflage for their getaways. That strategy held right up until the morning outside Butler. After robbing the P.H. Butler Company grocery store, the trio sped west, unaware that a witness had already given police a description of their car. When Corporal Paul and Patrolman Ernest Moore stopped the Chevrolet, the shooting started almost immediately. Paul was hit multiple times and would die of his wounds that same day. Moore was seriously injured but survived. The fugitives sped off, carjacked another vehicle to throw off pursuit, and eventually made their way back toward Wheeling, where they dropped off Tom Crawford and young Donnie before vanishing again. And here the case took a turn that has haunted it ever since. When investigators tracked down 4-year-old Donnie, the boy talked. In his innocent, matter-of-fact way, he described exactly what he had seen. He told them, in words that would be repeated in courtrooms and newspapers across the country, that his mother had shot one of the officers, and that his Uncle Tom had shot the other through the windshield. The testimony of a small child, recounting his mother's crime without understanding what it meant, became a devastating piece of the case against Irene Schroeder. To muddy the trail, Irene had by then changed the spelling of her name from Schroeder to Schroeder, but it was already too late. While the manhunt widened, Schroeder and Daig fled west, leaving a trail of robberies and violence in their wake. The pursuit finally ended far from Pennsylvania, in Arizona, where the pair were run down after yet another shootout with law enforcement, a gunfight that left a sheriff's deputy fatally wounded. Captured at last, Irene and Glenn were brought back east by train to stand trial for the murder of Corporal Paul. Even then, Irene played the role the press had handed her. Reveling in her strange celebrity, she reportedly posed for photographs and signed autographs along the way, styling herself as Irene Schroeder, the Trigger Woman. The trial, held in Newcastle in the early months of 1930, was a national sensation. Something like 20 newspapers from around the country sent correspondents, joined by the Associated Press and reporters from overseas. Among them, a young syndicated columnist named Ed Sullivan, who would later become a household name in television. The press gave Irene a whole gallery of lurid nicknames: Iron Irene, the Blonde Bandit, Trigger Woman, the Tiger Girl. But behind the spectacle, the evidence was overwhelming, including the account of her own son. Irene Schroeder was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Brady Paul. In a separate trial, Glenn Daig was convicted as well. Both were sentenced to death. For over a year, the pair sat in custody as their appeals worked through the courts. Pennsylvania had never before executed a woman in its electric chair, and the prospect stirred real public debate. Several women's groups protested, arguing that Schroeder deserved the same leniency that juries and governors had so often extended to female offenders. But Governor Gifford Pinchot declined to intervene. On February 17, 1931, her 22nd birthday, Irene was allowed to see her son Donnie one last time. 6 days later, on the morning of February 23, 1931, Irene Schroeder was put to death in the electric chair at Rockview Penitentiary in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. She went to her death calmly. The man who carried out the execution later remarked on how composed and fearless she seemed. Glenn Daig was executed just minutes after her in the same chair. With that, Irene Schroeder became the first woman ever electrocuted in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The most enduring image of the whole tragedy belongs not to Irene, but to her little boy. Told gently that his mother was going to die, 4-year-old Donnie is said to have replied, "I'll bet my mom would make an awful nice angel." He would grow up under the weight of that history, eventually distancing himself from his mother's infamy, and remarkably going on to serve his country as a decorated gunner in the Korean War before working on America's space program. Corporal Brady Paul, the young officer Irene killed, is still honored today. He holds the grim distinction of being one of the earliest Pennsylvania Highway Patrol officers killed in the line of duty, and a monument marks the spot where he fell. Nearly a century later, the case of the blonde bombshell endures as Pennsylvania's own chapter in the story of Depression-era outlaws, a reminder that behind the glamorous nicknames the newspapers loved, here was a police officer who never went home, and a little boy who lost his mother to the electric chair. Miranda Barbour, Chapter 2013.
Are you saying that you have killed before?
Yes.
On the morning of November 12, 2013, a woman in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, a small city of fewer than 10,000 people, about 100 miles northwest of Philadelphia, looked out into her backyard and saw a man's body lying in an alley behind her home. The man had been stabbed to death. He carried no identification, and at first no one knew who he was. But the answer was sitting in his own pocket on his cell phone. The last call he ever received had come from a number that would lead police to a 19-year-old newlywed named Miranda Barbour, and to one of the strangest, most chilling murder cases the little city had ever seen. The victim was identified as Troy LaFerrara, a 42-year-old man from nearby Port Trevorton. He was an engineer, and by the accounts of the people who knew him, an ordinary man with a private life he kept to himself. What investigators pieced together was that on the previous day, November 11th, LaFerrara had answered an advertisement on Craigslist, an ad offering companionship in exchange for money. He had no way of knowing that the young woman on the other end of that posting was not looking for a paying arrangement at all. She was looking for someone to kill. Miranda Barbour was just 19 years old, and she had recently arrived in Pennsylvania. Only weeks earlier she had married a man named Elite Barbour, and the two had moved to central Pennsylvania from North Carolina. They had been married for barely 3 weeks, and in that short time the couple had reportedly settled on a shared and monstrous ambition. They simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone together. Troy LaFerrara, responding to an anonymous ad, became the stranger they chose. On the afternoon of November 11th, Miranda arranged to meet LaFerrara, picking him up in her red Honda at a mall in the Selinsgrove area. What Irara could not see was that her husband, Elite, was hidden in the back seat of the car, concealed under a blanket, waiting. Miranda drove into Sunbury, and at a prearranged moment she gave a signal. Elita rose up from behind and looped a cord around LaFerrara's throat, pulling it tight to hold him in place. And as her husband restrained the much larger man, LaFerrara stood well over 6 feet tall, Miranda Barbour stabbed him. She struck him roughly 20 times. When it was over, the couple dumped his body in the alley where it would be found the next morning, and then, according to investigators, they bought cleaning supplies to wash the blood from the car and reportedly went out to eat. The unraveling came quickly, and it came through the phone. When detectives examined LaFerrara's cell phone, they saw that the final incoming call had come from Miranda Barbour's number. Confronted, she initially denied even knowing him. But her story shifted as the evidence mounted, and before long the full shape of the crime came into view. Her husband, Elite, confessed his own role after police obtained surveillance footage showing him buying the supplies used to clean the vehicle. And in a detail that stripped away any possible claim of self-defense, Elite told investigators the plain and horrifying truth, that he and his wife had killed LaFerrara because they wanted to kill someone together and had chosen to do it to mark their 3-week wedding anniversary. Both Miranda and Elite Barber were charged with the murder, and initially both pleaded not guilty, but the case took an even darker turn in early 2014, when Miranda, speaking from prison, gave a jailhouse interview to a reporter from the local newspaper, The Daily Item. In that conversation, she made an astonishing claim that Troy LaFerrara was far from her only victim. She stated that she had killed many other people over the previous 6 years as part of her involvement in a satanic cult, describing killings in states including Alaska, Texas, North Carolina, and California. When she was asked how many people she had killed, she said that when she reached 22, she stopped counting. She added that if she were ever released, she would kill again.
Are you saying that you have killed before? How many times, Miranda?
I know that when I hit 22, I stopped counting.
When you hit 22, you stopped counting.
Her claim set off a wave of national attention and prompted investigators, including the FBI, to look into whether there was any truth to them. But the checks came back empty. Law enforcement in the states she named could find nothing to substantiate a single one of the additional killings. The organization she claimed to be affiliated with publicly denied any connection to her, and her own family was openly skeptical. Her relatives described her as a manipulative and habitual liar, with one calling her the most manipulative person he had ever known. To this day, Troy LaFerrara remains her only confirmed victim. Whether the rest was a disturbed fantasy, a bid for notoriety, or something else entirely, has never been resolved. But no evidence ever supported it. What was never in doubt was her guilt in LaFerrara's death. In the summer of 2014, as the case moved toward what was expected to be a high-profile capital trial, prosecutors had announced their intention to seek the death penalty, citing the robbery and the cruelty of the crime. The Barbers abruptly changed course. On August 26, 2014, at what was supposed to be a routine status hearing in Northumberland County Court, both Miranda and Elite Barber pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The plea carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, and in exchange it removed the death penalty from the table. The formal sentencing followed that September. Miranda Barber, then 19, and her husband were each sentenced to life without parole. At the hearing, members of Troy LaFerrara's family spoke about the man they had lost and the emptiness left behind. His sister described the couple in stark terms, telling the court that they lacked the most basic element of humanity, that they had no conscience, no remorse, and no moral compass. The judge, in handing down the sentences, said he found it difficult to comprehend the pair's sheer indifference to the value of a human life, and remarked that their permanent removal from society was the only appropriate outcome. Today, both Miranda and Elite Barber remain in Pennsylvania prisons, serving their life terms. The case has lingered in the public imagination, in part because of the sheer randomness of it, the idea that a man could answer an ordinary online ad and walk into a death that had been planned by two strangers simply for the experience of killing. It became widely known as the Craigslist killing, after the site where Miranda had placed the companionship ad that drew LaFerrara in. And the lesson that unsettled so many people was a simple and frightening one. Troy LaFerrara was a 42-year-old man who thought he was meeting one person for a private arrangement. Instead, he had been selected, almost at random, by a young couple who wanted a stranger to kill, and who very nearly walked away from it, undone, in the end, by nothing more than the last phone call on their victim's phone. Nancy Folk, 2018. On the evening of September 11, 2018, a 911 call came in from a rural property on Mountain Penny Lane in the small community of Claysburg in Blair County, Pennsylvania. The caller was a 71-year-old woman named Nancy Folk, and she told the dispatcher that her husband had just been shot. When state troopers arrived, they found 74-year-old David Fox Sr. inside a shed on the property, dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. The story Nancy told that night was one of self-defense. a terrifying struggle in which, she said, her husband had come at her with a gun. But the physical evidence would tell a different story, and more than 5 years later, a jury would conclude that what happened in that shed was not self-defense at all, but a calculated first-degree murder. To the people who knew them, Nancy and David Vogt were simply an elderly couple who had been married for over half a century. They had raised children together and grown old on their quiet property in the hills of Bedford County. David, by 2018, was in declining health. He had suffered a heart attack and was, by various accounts, a diminished man physically. On the surface, theirs looked like an ordinary long marriage entering its final chapter. But according to Nancy, the truth behind closed doors had been very different for a very long time. When the case eventually came to trial, Nancy Vogt took the stand in her own defense and described what she said were decades of abuse, stretching back to the 1960s, not long after the couple was married. She spoke, at times emotionally, of living in fear, of never knowing what would set her husband off. She described threats involving firearms, including one chilling account of waking to find him pointing a gun near her head, warning her that if she ever tried to leave, he would kill her. It was a portrait of a marriage that, in her telling, had been defined by intimidation and dread. This account is central to understanding how she framed what happened, and it deserves to be stated plainly. But it also sat against a set of facts that the jury ultimately found impossible to reconcile with a claim of self-defense. The first problem was the story itself, which did not stay consistent. On the night of the shooting, Nancy told both the 911 operator and the responding troopers a specific version of events, that she and David had been arguing throughout the day, that he had gone into the house and returned to the shed with a revolver, that he fired a shot at her and missed, and that the gun went off a second time as they struggled over it, striking him in the chest. It was a self-defense narrative, a wife fighting for her life against an armed husband. But when investigators examined the scene and the evidence, the account began to fall apart. A forensic analysis of the fatal wound indicated that David Vogt could not have been shot from the close hand-to-hand distance that a struggle over the gun would have required. The physical facts simply didn't match the story of two people wrestling for the weapon. There were other details that troubled investigators as well: the position of the revolver, found outside the shed, and indications that the scene had been arranged after the fact. Faced with these inconsistencies, police brought Nancy Vogt in for a second interview in January of 2019, several months after the shooting, once the laboratory analysis was complete. And this time, confronted with the evidence, her story changed dramatically. She admitted that her husband had never fired at her at all. She acknowledged that she had been the one to bring the gun to the shed. She said she had closed the shed's double doors so that no one would see what was happening inside. And then she fired 2 rounds, killing David. That admission transformed the case. The self-defense claim she had told that first night was, by her own later account, untrue. Nancy Vogt was arrested and charged with criminal homicide and tampering with evidence, and she has been in custody since January of 2019. Her case went to trial in September of 2023 in Bedford County. It was, in many ways, a difficult and emotionally complicated proceeding, because the jury had to weigh 2 very different pictures of the same woman. On one side was the defense's portrait of a long-abused wife who had finally reached a breaking point. On the other was the prosecution's case, that Nancy Vogt had intentionally taken a gun to the shed, shot a frail and ailing husband who could not defend himself, staged the scene to look like something it wasn't, and then lied to 9/11 to the police, and even to her own children. The prosecution pressed hard on the timeline. They pointed out that the most recent specific incident of abuse Nancy described had occurred roughly 19 years before the killing, not in the immediate, life-threatening moment that a self-defense claim requires. They emphasized that on the day David died, by Nancy's own account, he had not actually threatened to kill her, and they highlighted the staging and the lies as evidence of a guilty, calculating mind rather than a panicked victim. There was also a legal dimension that worked against her. Because the shooting happened in a shed outside the home rather than inside it, the judge instructed the jury that Pennsylvania law imposed a duty to attempt to retreat before using deadly force. a point the defense strongly contested, but one that shaped how the jury could view her actions. In the end, after deliberating for only about 90 minutes, the jury found Nancy Falk guilty of first-degree murder, along with tampering with evidence. It was the most serious of the options available to them. Notably, before the trial, prosecutors had offered her a plea deal to third-degree murder, with a recommended sentence of 8 to 20 years, an offer she turned down, choosing instead to take her chances at trial. That decision proved costly. On October 27, 2023, Nancy Falk, by then 75 years old, was sentenced to the mandatory penalty for first-degree murder in Pennsylvania, life in prison without the possibility of parole. She later appealed, arguing among other things that the jury had been wrongly instructed on the duty to retreat. But in 2025, the Pennsylvania Superior Court rejected her appeal and upheld the conviction. The case left a genuinely uncomfortable question hanging over the community, and it's one worth acknowledging honestly. Cases like this one sit at a painful intersection, where a real history of alleged domestic abuse meets a killing that the law and a jury determined was not committed in self-defense. The jury heard Nancy Falk's account of decades of fear, and they still concluded that when she carried that gun into the shed and closed the doors, she was not defending her life, but ending his. What is beyond dispute is that David Falk Sr., 74 years old and in failing health, died in a shed on the property where he had lived for years, and that the woman who killed him spent months insisting it had happened another way. A jury of her peers decided the truth, and Nancy Falk will spend the rest of her life in prison because of it. Martha Grinder, 1866. On the morning of January 19, 1866, in the yard of the county prison in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a 50-year-old woman named Martha Grinder was led to a gallows and hanged before a gathering of witnesses. She went to her death with a striking, almost unsettling calm, composed and serene by the accounts of those who watched. It was a remarkable end to one of the most sensational criminal cases of the Civil War era, because Martha Grinder was not a robber or a brawler or a woman driven to violence by desperation. She was a seemingly ordinary housewife, a neighbor who had spent months tenderly nursing a sick friend at that friend's bedside. And the whole time she had been the one making her sick, slowly, deliberately, and for no reason anyone could fully explain, except that she seemed to enjoy it. To understand how a quiet neighborhood woman became known across the country as the Pittsburgh Poisoner, you have to go back to the years just before her arrest, to the household she shared with her husband. Martha and her husband had relocated to Pittsburgh, and it was there, in the ordinary rhythms of neighborhood life, that the deaths began to cluster around her. To the people who knew her, Martha Grinder appeared to be a kind and attentive woman, exactly the sort of neighbor you would want nearby in a time of illness. When someone near her fell sick, Martha was there, offering to help, to nurse, to sit with the suffering and bring them food and comfort. It was a role that gave her intimate, trusted access to the very people who would become her victims. The case that would ultimately send her to the gallows centered on a young neighbor named Mary Carruthers. Mrs. Carruthers lived close by, and when she became ill, Martha Grinder stepped in as her devoted caretaker, tending to her over a period of weeks. But rather than recovering under Martha's attentive care, Mary Carruthers only grew worse. She suffered terribly, racked by the violent symptoms of what would later be recognized as poisoning, the agony of arsenic slowly accumulating in her body. Martha, all the while, played the part of the concerned friend, nursing the very illness she was secretly causing. Mary Carruthers eventually died, and her death, coming after such prolonged and mysterious suffering, finally drew the suspicion that Martha had so far managed to avoid. As questions mounted about Mary Carruthers' death, investigators and physicians began to look more closely, and what they found pointed unmistakably toward poison. Arsenic, a substance widely available in that era, commonly sold as rat poison and in various household products, was the likely cause. Once suspicion fell on Martha Grinder, the pattern of deaths and illnesses that had trailed her began to take on a sinister new meaning. It emerged that Mary Carruthers was not her only victim. A young woman named Jane Buchanan, who had worked as a servant or maid in connection with the Grinder household, had also died under circumstances that now looked deeply suspicious. Martha would ultimately confess to poisoning both women. But the confession, when it came, is what truly horrified the public and cemented Martha Grinder's dark reputation. When asked to explain herself, to give some reason, some motive for what she had done, she offered no story of greed, no inheritance, no revenge, no romantic entanglement. Instead, she gave an answer that revealed something far more disturbing. She said, in words that were reported across the nation, that she loved to see death in all its forms and phases, and that she had left no opportunity to indulge that morbid fascination. She reportedly added that, had she been able to continue, she would have done still more. Here was a killer who murdered not for gain, but simply to watch people die. It was a kind of motive that the public of the 1860s had little framework to understand, and the newspapers reached for the darkest language they could find, branding her a demon, a fiend, and comparing her to Lucretia Borgia, the infamous poisoner of the Italian Renaissance. The full scope of Martha Grinder's crimes has never been established with certainty, and this is one of the areas where the historical record leaves genuine questions. Lacey was convicted and confessed in connection with the deaths of Mary Carruthers and Jane Buchanan. Contemporary accounts suggested she may have been responsible for a great many more, poisonings among her extended family, other neighbors, and household help stretching back years, possibly even before she came to Pittsburgh. Some accounts place the number of her suspected victims far higher, though those additional cases were never definitively proven. What is clear is that she was recognized, even in her own time, as one of the most prolific and coldly methodical poisoners America had yet seen, a woman who used the trusted role of caregiver as the perfect cover for murder. Martha Grinder was tried for the murder of Mary Carruthers, the case in which the evidence against her was strongest. The trial was a public sensation, drawing intense coverage as the story of the poisoning housewife spread far beyond Pittsburgh. The evidence, the arsenic, the pattern of deaths, and ultimately her own admissions, was overwhelming. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. In the months between her conviction and her execution, Martha Grinder remained a figure of intense public fascination, and on that January morning in 1866, she was hanged in the yard of the Allegheny County Jail. Reports of the execution noted that she appeared composed and unafraid as she faced her death. There is a grim historical footnote about the hanging itself. By some accounts, she struggled for several minutes after the drop. The execution reportedly complicated by problems with the equipment. With her death, Martha Grinder earned a permanent, unwelcome place in the city's history as the second woman ever to be executed in Pittsburgh. The case left a lasting mark, and not only because of its body count. What made Martha Grinder so unforgettable and so genuinely frightening to the people of her era was the sheer absence of an ordinary motive. Killers who murdered for money or vengeance were, in a terrible way, comprehensible. But a woman who spent weeks lovingly nursing her neighbors while secretly feeding them poison, purely for the satisfaction of watching them suffer and die, was something people struggled to even name. In the language of a later age, she would come to be understood as one of America's earliest documented female serial killers, driven by something like a compulsion to kill for its own sake. Nearly 160 years later, the story of the Pittsburgh poisoner endures as one of the darkest chapters in the city's history, a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself, and that in Martha Grinder's case, it arrived wearing the face of a caring neighbor at the sickbed. Mary Carruthers and Jane Buchanan trusted the woman who came to help them in their time of need. That trust cost them their lives. And Martha Grinder went to the gallows having admitted in chilling terms that she had done it all simply because she wanted to. Karina Favato and Philadelphia Poison Ring Women, 1930s. In the autumn of 1938, a routine counterfeiting investigation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, stumbled onto something almost beyond belief. A federal agent, working undercover to buy fake currency from a small-time crook named Herman Petrillo, was offered a very different kind of business proposition. Petrillo asked the agent if he'd be willing to kill a man, to murder a sick laborer so that the victim's life insurance could be cashed in. That single offer pulled the first thread on what would unravel into one of the largest murder-for-profit operations in American history, a sprawling ring operating for most of the decade in the immigrant neighborhoods of South Philadelphia that had quietly poisoned dozens of people for their insurance money. And at the dark heart of it was a woman her neighbors called the Witch, a fortune-teller and faith healer named Carino Favato. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the time and place. The 1930s were the depths of the Great Depression, and South Philadelphia was home to a large community of Italian immigrants, many of them poor, isolated by language, and steeped in old country traditions of folk magic, spiritual healing, and charms. It was fertile ground for predators who could disguise murder as mysticism. The ring was led by two cousins, Herman Petrillo, a spaghetti salesman and skilled counterfeiter, and Paul Petrillo, a tailor with a talent for insurance scams, along with a Russian-born spiritualist named Morris Bulber, who styled himself a master of the dark arts. Together, the men built what amounted to a murder business, complete with a fake matchmaking service that paired lonely immigrant widows with new husbands, took out insurance policies on those husbands, and then made sure the men died. Carino Favato brought something the men couldn't. No. On throughout her neighborhood as a witch and a healer, she had the trust of the very people the ring wanted to target. Frightened, unhappy wives came to her seeking spiritual help, a charm to win back a straying husband, a remedy for their troubles. That trust made Favato the perfect recruiter and the perfect poisoner, and she came to the operation with a resume of her own. Long before she joined forces with the Petrillos, Favato had, by her own later admission, already dispatched 3 of her own men, poisoning them and turning her private murders into a profession. The method the ring perfected was chillingly simple. Favato and the others would identify a vulnerable target, often an unhappy wife married to a poor laborer or a lonely immigrant man with no family to ask questions. Insurance policies would be quietly taken out on the intended victim, sometimes with forged signatures, and frequently written with a double indemnity clause that paid out twice as much if the death appeared accidental. Then came the poison. Arsenic, cheap, easy to obtain, and readily available as ordinary rat poison, would be slipped into the victim's food, drink, or medicine, often described to a superstitious wife as a love potion or a healing powder that would fix her marriage. Arsenic poisoning produces symptoms that closely resemble natural illnesses of the era, and a slow death from it could easily be written off by an overworked doctor as heart failure or gastric disease. When poison wasn't practical, the ring turned to blunter methods, staged falls, drownings on fishing trips, a hit and run, all designed to look like tragic accidents. Over the course of the decade, investigators would come to believe the ring's victims numbered somewhere between 30 and perhaps as many as 100, though the true figure will never be known, precisely because so many of the deaths were successfully disguised as natural. For years it worked. The bodies were buried, the policies were paid, and the money, an estimated $100,000 over the life of the operation, was collected and divided. But greed, as it so often does, proved to be the ring's undoing. When Herman Petrillo tried to recruit that undercover agent to carry out a killing in 1938, and when the intended victim, a laborer named Ferdinando Alfonsi, was found gravely ill and riddled with arsenic before he died, the authorities finally had a live case. The district attorney's office, ICE launched an aggressive investigation, and detectives began exhuming bodies from cemeteries across the city, testing the remains for arsenic. Grave after grave gave up its secret. As the arrests mounted, the ring collapsed in on itself, with its members turning on one another in a desperate scramble for leniency. Herman Petrillo was convicted of first-degree murder in March of 1939, but the moment that truly cracked the case open belonged to Carino Favato. On April 21, 1939, at her own murder trial, Favato stunned the courtroom by abruptly halting the proceedings and pleading guilty. She confessed to 3 murders, those of her common-law husband, Charles Ingrao, her stepson, Philip Ingrao, and a man named Giuseppe Di Martino. Having admitted her own crimes, the Witch of South Philadelphia then agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, becoming a key witness against the rest of the ring. Her testimony, along with that of Morris Bulber, who also turned state's evidence, helped send her former partners to their fates. The reckoning was severe, though uneven. In the end, roughly 22 members of the poison ring were convicted or pleaded guilty in connection with the murders. The two masterminds, Herman and Paul Petrillo, were sentenced to death and were executed in the electric chair in 1941. Because they had cooperated, both Morris Bulber and Carino Favato were spared the chair and instead sentenced to life in prison. Favato, the woman who had used her reputation as a healer to mark her neighbors for death, would spend the rest of her days behind bars. Not everyone accused met the same end, and this is an important part of the story. The justice system of the era did not simply sweep up everyone who came under suspicion. Several of the so-called poison widows were acquitted or had charges dropped. One woman the press had luridly dubbed the Rose of Death, accused of involvement in multiple deaths, was tried and found not guilty by a jury and walked free. And the widow, whose husband's poisoning had first blown the case open, was herself acquitted after a spirited legal defense. In a case swollen with sensational headlines and public hysteria, the court still drew a line between the guilty and the merely accused. The Philadelphia poison ring left a permanent mark on the city and on the history of American crime. It stands as one of the earliest and most extensive murder-for-insurance conspiracies ever uncovered in the United States, and it prompted real changes in how insurance companies scrutinize policies and payouts. But what lingers most is the sheer cold-bloodedness of the scheme and the role played by a woman like Carino Favato, someone who took the trust her neighbors placed in her, their fear and their hope and their belief in her spiritual gifts, and turned it into a weapon. The people who came to her door were looking for help with the hardest parts of their loss. Jeeves. Some of them left with a powder she told them would heal a marriage, never knowing they had just been handed the instrument of a murder. In the end, the Witch of South Philadelphia was exactly what the frightened whispers had always said she was, just not in the way anyone had imagined. Carolyn King, 1994. On September 25, 1993, a police officer in the small borough of Palmyra in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, went to check on a well-known local resident who hadn't been seen in more than a week. Guy Goodman was a 74-year-old retired florist, a fixture in the community, the kind of man neighbors noticed when he suddenly went quiet. When the officer looked through a window, he could see that the house was in disarray, and when he went inside, he was met with an unmistakable odor. In the basement, partially covered by a blanket, he found Goodman's body, bound with cords and hogtied, left there to die days earlier. What investigators would soon uncover was that Goodman's killing had been only the beginning. His death launched a nationwide manhunt and a trail of stolen money that stretched clear across the country. And at the center of it was a 30-year-old woman named Carolyn King and the man she had run away with. To understand how it started, you have to go back to the Lebanon County Prison and to an unlikely romance. Carolyn Ann King was a married mother of 4 from the Hershey area of Pennsylvania. Through a job at a local packaging company, she had begun a relationship with a young inmate named Bradley Martin, who was serving time for a parole violation. Martin, in his early 20s, had been considered a model prisoner, enough that he was granted the privilege of work release passes, allowing him to leave the facility during the day. On September 15, 1993, Martin walked out of the prison on a 2-hour pass. He met Carolyn King, and he simply never went back. The two made their way to Palmyra, to the home of Guy Goodman, a man Martin actually knew. Goodman had corresponded with Martin during his incarceration, writing to him, calling him, even visiting, and considering himself the young man's friend. That trust would cost him his life. At some point, King and Martin had decided to get money out of Goodman, and they were prepared to use force to do it. Inside the home, Martin struck the elderly man over the head with a vase and tied him up. Goodman was left bound and helpless, and he died there in his own house. The couple took what they had come for, his car, his credit card, and his checkbook, and drove away, leaving his body to be discovered more than a week later. From there, the case became something rarely seen, a genuine cross-country crime spree. Over the next several days, King and Martin fled westward in Goodman's car, and everywhere they went, they lived on the dead man's money. Investigators would later count roughly 33 separate uses of Goodman's credit card and checks, a trail of transactions that lit up across the map, through Ohio and Indiana, into Illinois, out to North Dakota, and onward toward Nevada and California. As one former prosecutor memorably put it, someone had gone on a cross-country shopping spree, courtesy of a dead man. And crucially, the employees who waited on the couple at various stores would later tell investigators that Carolyn King did not appear to be under any kind of duress. She wasn't a hostage being dragged along, she was a participant. But the spree was not only about spending. Somewhere along that western route, the violence resumed. In North Dakota, King and Martin abducted a 59-year-old woman named Donna Mae Wiseman from a hotel parking lot in Bismarck. They took her with them, and in the desert of Nevada, they killed her. What had begun as a single robbery murder in a quiet Pennsylvania town had become a two-victim odyssey of killing and theft spanning nearly a dozen states. The couple's undoing came through the very trail of money that had funded their flight. As Goodman's credit card kept surfacing in city after city, detectives were able to track the pair's movements almost in real time. When a hotel clerk grew suspicious of the card and threatened to report it, King and Martin fled in a hurry, but by then the net was closing. The pursuit finally ended on October 5, 1993, in Yuma, Arizona, when police arrested both of them at a motel after identifying the stolen vehicle and matching the credit card transactions roughly 3 weeks after Guy Goodman had last been seen alive. After being taken into custody, both King and Martin gave statements. Martin admitted striking Goodman and tying him up, and King too confessed her own involvement to investigators, implicating both herself and Martin in the killing. The couple was brought back to Pennsylvania to face justice for Goodman's murder first. In 1994, a Lebanon County jury found both Carolyn King and Bradley Martin guilty of first-degree murder, along with related charges. The jury did not stop there. Given the brutality of the crime, the killing of a trusting elderly friend for his money and his car, both defendants were sentenced to death. Their convictions and death sentences were upheld on direct appeal in 1998. And there was still the matter of Nevada. For the murder of Donna Mae Wiseman, King and Martin were separately prosecuted there, and each received additional life sentences to be served consecutively. For years, Carolyn King sat on Pennsylvania's death row, one of only a small number of women ever sentenced to die in the state. But her sentence, like her co-defendants, would ultimately be reduced. Through the long appeals process, questions were raised about how the penalty phase of their trial had been handled, and about the mitigating evidence that had, or hadn't, been presented to the jury. Combined with the broader legal and political shifts around capital punishment in Pennsylvania, including a moratorium on executions imposed by the governor, the path to an execution effectively closed. Bradley Martin was resentenced to life in prison without parole in the mid-2010s, giving up his remaining appeals in exchange. Carolyn King's death sentence was likewise set aside, and she was resentenced to life imprisonment. Today, she remains behind bars, serving that life term with no prospect of release. One detail has haunted this case for everyone who has followed it: the absence of a why. In the decades since, neither Carolyn King nor Bradley Martin has ever offered a real explanation for what they did. No coherent motive beyond the money, no accounting for why a trusting old man and a woman pulled from a parking lot had to die. Goodman's daughter, Judy, was never given an answer for why her father was taken from her. A former reporter who covered the trial and spent decades trying to make sense of it admitted he never could. The families were left with the same emptiness that so often follows senseless violence, the knowledge of exactly what happened, paired with the permanent mystery of why. What remains beyond dispute is the human toll. Guy Goodman was a 74-year-old man who had extended nothing but friendship to Bradley Martin, and who was killed in his own home for a car and a credit card. Donna Mae Wiseman was a 59-year-old woman who had the terrible misfortune of crossing paths with two people in the middle of a killing spree. Their deaths, days and hundreds of miles apart, were bound together by the same pair of hands, and by a young woman from Pennsylvania who, by her own admission, was there for all of it. Verity Beck, 3. On the night of January 17, 2023, a man named Justin Beck drove to his parents' home on Beverly Road in Abington Township, a quiet suburb about 12 miles north of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was worried. He hadn't spoken to his mother and father since the 7th of the month, 10 days of silence that was completely unlike them. When he went inside to check on them, he made a discovery that would horrify an entire community. In a downstairs bedroom, he found a body covered with a bloody sheet, and nearby a chainsaw. His parents, Reed and Miriam Beck, were dead, and the person responsible was still in the house, his own sister, 43-year-old Verity Beck, who lived there with their parents. Justin left, called the police, and set in motion the unraveling of one of the most gruesome cases Montgomery County had ever seen. To understand what happened inside that home, you have to understand the family and the quiet crisis that had been building within it. Reed Beck was 73. Miriam Beck was 72. They were an ordinary elderly couple living out their retirement years, and they shared their home with their adult daughter, Verity. By outward appearances, Verity Beck's life had once been unremarkable and even admirable. She had worked as a teacher at a school for special education, a career built on patience and care. But by early 2023, her life had quietly come apart. She was no longer teaching, she was struggling financially, and the tension inside the house on Beverly Road had been steadily rising. At the center of that tension was money. In the months and years before the killings, Reed and Miriam Beck had grown increasingly concerned that their daughter was stealing from them. The friction was documented in the most ordinary of ways, in text messages between parents and child. The couple had confronted Verity about a missing rent check connected to a property they owned at the shore. Just days before their deaths, her father had confronted her again, this time about unauthorized purchases made using his bank account, including online orders and an expensive piece of jewelry. What might, in another family, have been an uncomfortable argument about finances became, in this one, the prelude to murder. Investigators believe that on or around January 7, 2023, Verity Beck shot both of her parents. Each of them died from a single gunshot wound to the head. In the days that followed, rather than call for help or turn herself in, Verity did something almost impossible to comprehend. Using a chainsaw, she dismembered her parents' bodies. We will not describe the details of what she did. It is enough to say that she took steps to take the remains apart and to conceal them, placing them in trash bags and containers within the home. And then, chillingly, she simply continued to live in the house alongside what she had done for as long as 10 days until her brother came looking. That is what makes the timeline of this case so unsettling. In the interval between the killings and the discovery, Verity remained in contact with her brother by text, even as their parents lay dead in the home. On the very night Justin ultimately came over, he had actually planned to bring his sister some soup, because she had told him she was feeling ill. When he arrived and asked her, directly, whether something bad had happened to their parents, Verity reportedly answered him with a single word: yes. She told him only that things at home had been bad. It was Justin who then went home and called the authorities. When Abington Township police arrived, the scene they encountered confirmed the worst. Officers found one victim tightly wrapped in a bloodied bedsheet and evidence of the second nearby, along with the chainsaw and multiple firearms recovered from the home. The county district attorney would later describe the sheer difficulty of the work that followed. That these were among the hardest autopsies his office had ever had to conduct, precisely because of the condition in which the victims were found. Verity Beck was taken into custody, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional counts including abuse of a corpse and possession of instruments of crime, the firearm and the chainsaw. She was held without bail. From the beginning, the central legal question in the case was not who had killed Reed and Miriam Beck. Verity's presence in the home and the evidence left little doubt about that. The real battle would be over her state of mind. As the case moved toward trial, her defense signaled that they intended to pursue an insanity defense, arguing in court filings that at the time of the killings, she was suffering from such a severe disease of the mind that she could not understand the nature of what she was doing, or that it was wrong. Prosecutors, for their part, had already announced that they would not seek the death penalty, citing the absence of the specific legal factors required for a capital case. Verity underwent multiple mental health evaluations, and she was found competent to stand trial. In the end, the case did not go to a jury. On September 30th, 2024, Verity Beck, by then 45 years old, entered a negotiated plea. She pleaded guilty, but mentally ill, to 2 counts of first-degree murder. That particular verdict is an important one to understand because it is not the same as being found not guilty by reason of insanity. A plea of guilty but mentally ill means the defendant is held fully criminally responsible for the crime. The court concluded that Verity Beck was legally sane when she killed her parents and understood that what she was doing was wrong, while also formally recognizing that she suffers from mental illness and directing that she receive treatment during her incarceration. In other words, she was found both guilty and accountable, not excused. The sentence reflected that. Verity Beck was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, 1 term for each of her parents. As part of her sentence, she will receive mental health treatment while behind bars. One of the prosecutors on the case put the outcome in blunt terms, telling reporters that this was a dangerous person who was sane when she did the crime, who knew that what she did was wrong, and who would now pay for it for the rest of her life. Led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Verity Beck remained silent when reporters asked her why. That question, why, is the one the case never fully answered to anyone's satisfaction. On paper, the motive was money, a financial dispute between a struggling adult daughter and the parents who had taken her in and then accused her of stealing from them. But a dispute over a rent check and some unauthorized purchases sits so wildly out of proportion to what followed that it can never truly explain it. What is beyond dispute is the loss at the center of it. Reed and Miriam Beck were a married couple in their 70s who had opened their home to their own daughter and who died at her hands within its walls over a matter of money. They deserved to grow old in peace in the home they shared. Instead, their final days were spent in fear of the person they had raised, and their deaths became a case so disturbing it left even seasoned investigators shaken. The stories in this documentary crossed more than a century and a half of Pennsylvania history. Different eras, different places, different motives, money, obsession, revenge, and in some cases, something far harder to name. But nearly every one of them shared a single, chilling trait. They didn't strike from the shadows. They struck from inside the circle of trust, as wives, as daughters, as the ones people counted on. That's what made these cases haunt the communities they touched. And long after the verdicts were read and the prison doors closed, the same question always lingered in the towns they left behind. How did no one see it coming? But through all of it, we never want to lose sight of who this is really about. Behind every one of these cases is a person who didn't come home. A husband, a pair of elderly parents, a trusting patient, a stranger who simply crossed the wrong path. They were more than the worst thing that ever happened to them, and they deserve to be remembered. Now, we want to hear from you. Of these 8 cases, which one disturbed you the most? And which one stayed with you long after it ended? Was there one where you're still not sure justice was truly served? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and the conversations down there are some of the best on this channel. And if there's a Pennsylvania case, or a case from your own state, that you think we should cover next, drop the name below. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending this time with us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. We release true crime stories like these every week. Until next time, take care of yourselves and stay safe out there.